You're very welcome. So my name is Peter Gray. I'm the director of the Institute of Irish Studies, for those who don't know me. So I'm wearing two hats tonight. One is as director to welcome you to what is part of our Irish Studies seminar series, but of course I'm also one of the authors, and I'll speak a bit more about my book later on. My principal role here is to introduce our principal speaker for this evening, who's going to speak about the two books which we're celebrating this afternoon. So our principal speaker is Professor Sean Connolly, who is Professor Emeritus of Irish History here at Queen's, very distinguished historian of a wide range of topics on Irish history, going back to the early modern period, even as far as the 15th century, and right up until the early 20th century and beyond. His most recent book, On Every Tide, as a survey of the Irish emigration experience and the development of the Irish diaspora across several centuries and globally, not just in North America, but considering that phenomenon in Australasia, in South Africa and South America as well. Before that, he was the editor of the, I suppose, the official history of Belfast 400, which was published in 2012 to mark the 400th anniversary. Yeah, I always get that wrong. Of the granting of the Charter of Belfast in 1613 to Arthur Chichester by James I. And Sean is an expert on the history of Belfast, and for that reason alone, there's no one better qualified to talk about these two books. My own book on William Sharman Crawford, who, amongst other things, fights an election in Belfast in 1832 and is heavily involved in Belfast politics. And also Sean Farrell's book, as you can see here, on Thomas Drew, who is the rector of Christ Church in Belfast from 1833 and a central figure in the development of popular politics in the developing city over a number of decades from the 1830s onwards. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sean Connolly, who's going to give us his unvarnished critique on these two books. Robust but fair is the way I usually describe your approach to publications. And Sean will speak, and then Sean and I will respond just briefly, express a few thanks to people who need to be thanked, and then there will be drinks and snacks afterwards. So bear with us for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then we'll proceed to celebrate in a more convivial way after that. So, John.
Well, good evening. Okay, we're here for the launch of two books, each of which deals with an individual. The high point of whose career was in the middle decades of the 19th century. Now, very unfortunately for our two authors, we have already had an authoritative assessment of what that period is all about. These are the words of Professor Vincent Comerford, writing back in 1989. The quarter century after the famine is of little interest. The nation hangs helplessly on the ropes for a few years, then gradually recovers sufficient spirit to put up a splendid fight under Mr. Parnell's coaching in the next important bout of Irish history. Now, needless to say, Vincent Comerford was not being serious. What he was doing was parodying what remains one of the besetting sins of people who write about the Irish past, which is to read that history backwards. So that in this perspective, the whole of the 19th century becomes a progression towards the statehood that was achieved in 1922. The important dates are 1798, 1848, 1867, 1916. And the long stretches of time in between are of no real interest. On the other hand, once we move away from this notion of the march of the nation, these middle decades, the 1840s, the 1850s, the 1860s, turn out to be a period of very great interest, and also very great complexity. This is precisely because once you strip away the supposed wisdom of hindsight, so many big questions in the mid-19th century remain open. Yes, the electoral system has been reformed, but property is still very much the basis of political power. Yes, Great Britain is emerging as the workshop of the world. Many people on both left and right are unreconciled to the notion of a society dominated by large-scale factory-based industry. In Ireland, there is continued opposition in varying degrees to the Act of Union, but these are also the decades in which Ireland, in cultural and economic terms, is becoming ever more integrated into the larger British state. And Irish politics in this period are still many-sided, a kaleidoscope of different interests and allegiances and alliances, with nothing that you could neatly categorize in terms of Catholic, Protestant, nationalist, unionist. So all this makes the mid-19th century, the period covered in these two books, a fascinating period. But it also makes it a very difficult period to deal with. Because once you take away the national narrative, where are the landmarks? What holds the period together? And that's where one particular genre of historical writing comes into its own, and that is, of course, biography. Because biography forces us to confine ourselves to the limits of a lifetime, to look at how a particular individual responded to the events of their own time as they happened, without the distorting prism of hindsight. And what we've got here are two biographies of very different individuals, but tracing in each case an individual's attempt to make sense of a fluid and unstable world. Now, if there's any one individual whose reputation has suffered because of the dominance of the March of a Nation narrative, it is the subject of Peter Gray's book, William Sharman Crawford. If you flick through any standard textbook, or if you sit through any set of introductory lectures in 19th century Ireland, including, I'm afraid, the ones I used to give myself in this very building, William Sharman Crawford will at most figure twice, and in each case in a supporting or secondary role. First of all, he is the exponent of something called federalism, which Daniel O'Connell briefly shows an interest in after Clontarf, provoking an almighty hissy fit from the Irelanders. And then secondly, he is the northern face of a short-lived attempt that doesn't really get off the ground to unite Catholics and Protestants and a common political movement on the basis of the land question. Now, in some respects, this image of a figure on the margins is justified. Crawford is a highly independent thinker and very much wedded to his own carefully worked out political ideas. It also is clear from Peter Gray's account that he does himself no favors in terms of certain eccentricities of dress and deportment, which make it easy to caricature him. I was struck by the number of times reading the book that the words crotchety and crotchet appear in the comments of his rivals. But none of this ought to distract from the significance of his ideas. Yes, it's true that the federalism he advocated found very few takers in the 1840s. But what he proposed was later to become the dominant issue in Irish politics for almost 50 years after 1870 under the catchier title of Home Rule. His proposals for giving tenant farmers a degree of security and a better share in the profit of their labours set the terms of the whole debate on Irish land reform right up to the 1880s, when they were replaced by, the catchier but much more mendacious slogan, the land for the people. Crawford also deserves credit for looking beyond the noisy tenant farmers to the needs of the landless. In 1849, at the height of the famine, he outlined his vision of putting more than 200,000 labouring families to work, reclaiming waste lands on which they could then be settled on plots of 8 to 10 acres. As a political programme, this is wildly unrealistic. If James Cleverly, our Home Secretary, had been around, he would almost certainly have categorised it with the Rwanda scheme as batshit crazy. But just taking it as a challenge to the prevailing Malthusian assumption, the dominant view that the only way Ireland could achieve prosperity was by shedding great part of what were regarded as its surplus population. Taking it as a challenge to that, then it qualifies Sharman Crawford to be counted among the radical thinkers, from Robert Owen to Marx and Engels, who had the imagination and insight to step outside the economic orthodoxies of their day. Now, Crawford was not just a thinker. He was also, despite the apparent eccentricities I mentioned, a very successful political operator. O'Connell and his acolytes are the source of some of the most vicious comments on Crawford. But in the period before he began to see Crawford as a potential rival, O'Connell thought highly enough of him to install him in Dundalk as an MP in O'Connell's party. And then from 1841, in a striking reminder of the extent to which English and Irish politics in this period are intertwined, he becomes MP for Rochdale, supported by a coalition of middle-class reformers and working-class radicals. From this base, he is highly active, supporting campaigning for universal suffrage, the secret ballot, factory reform, and the restructuring of the Poor Law. Meanwhile, back in Ireland, he did not become a member of the Tenant League. What's significant is how desperate the members of the Tenant League were nevertheless to have him on their side and be able to cite him. His ideas were central to his programme. He becomes his candidate in the hard-fought election of County Down in 1852, and he does play a prominent part in the debates surrounding its brief rise and rapid fall. All of this, I've been emphasizing the biographical dimension, but there's also a great deal in Peter Gray's book that illustrates the wider context we don't want to overlook. His account of his subject's father, William Sharman, brings out the complexity of political alignments in the 1780s and early 1790s, and the variety of stances a person could take. William Sharman is a country gentleman who goes a lot further than most of his peers in remaining associated with the movement for political reform. He does not become a United Irishman. On the other hand, neither does he join in the counter-revolutionary mobilization during the crisis of 1798. Later, there's an intriguing glimpse of a highly symbolic event at the height of enthusiasm for the Tenant League in 1851, a rally on the banks of the Boyne arranged for the 12th of July. Then you have an inscription of a vivid account of the County Down election of 1852, a reminder of, in this apparently quiet period, of just how violent, in fact, lethally violent, Irish electoral politics could become. So for any serious student of 19th century Ireland, this is a book with a lot to offer. Right, the subject of our second biography could hardly be more different. Thomas Drew, Church of Ireland minister at Christ Church in Durham Street from 1832 until 1859, when he retreated to a country living in Loughlin Island. Now, Christ Church, as you probably know, had been built specifically to cater for the new working class district that was growing up so rapidly to the west of the city centre and to the unchurched working class Protestants of this new suburb. And in this role, Drew is a model urban missionary. He establishes prayer stations across the district, creates a network of Sunday and day schools, institutes a program of regular home visitations. And he is highly successful. A census in 1852 suggests that around 2/3 of the Church of Ireland population of his district are church attenders, which is high by the standards of an industrial urban centre, particularly when you consider that there is a healthy ratio of men to women compared again to other centres. But at the same time, Drew, as you probably know, is one of Ireland's leading or most notorious religious controversialists. A prominent member of the Orange Order, notorious for his fierce anti-Catholic rhetoric, and seen by many people as a principal instigator of the town's recurrent sectarian violence. Now, what's surprising in a way is that despite all this, Drew has up to now remained a remarkably two-dimensional figure. He gets mentioned all the time, but nobody has actually analysed in detail his ideas or what he stood for. It's been left to Sean Farrell looking in detail at Drew's seminars, at his scattered correspondence and other material to give us a proper rounded picture of the man and his influence. One immediate task he faces is to reconcile the two faces that Drew presented to his contemporaries and to posterity. On the one hand, the dedicated evangelist to the Protestant poor, on the other hand, the ranting anti-Catholic bigot. Now for Drew, and this is one of the strong points that emerge from the book, the two are inseparable. His concern for the material and spiritual welfare of the Protestant working class, and his ferocious hostility to what he sees as the malign influence of Catholicism are both born out of the same passionate religious commitment. The Orange Order, the Sunday schools, support for factory reform are all part of the same outlook, what Sean Farrell neatly defines as a defensive Protestant populism. Now, this is not to suggest that Drew's thinking is entirely coherent or consistent. On the contrary, there is a striking contradiction at the heart of his work. He could be a very powerful rhetorical advocate for the needs of the working class to whom he ministered. One striking oration in 1855 talks about manufacturers who make their fortunes in Belfast industry and then retire to mansions in the countryside, leaving the workers on whose labour they had depended in the same misery as they found them. And for Drew, says that if they behave like this, the blight of God should descend on their pillared mansions and broad acres. Belfast gold should have no blessing when wrung from Belfast men. Fine stuff. But as Sean Farrell shows, when it comes to practical action, Drew consistently stops short of anything that would threaten the social order. He is strongly opposed to any attempt by Belfast workers to defend their position by trade union action. During the grim 1840s, he speaks out against proposals to increase the poor rates, arguing that the Ballymacarrat weavers, that if you take into account the difference between family income and individual income, the Ballymacarrat weavers are exaggerating their own distress. And in any case, they've brought their own troubles on themselves by strike action. Now, how do we make sense of all this? Professor Farrell very usefully brings in contemporary parallels, arguing that Drew is best understood as a Tory paternalist in the mold of Michael Sadler, who was actually briefly part of his congregation. At other times, and I'd be interested to hear what he says about this, he seems to verge towards a harsher verdict. The word opportunism does appear once. For myself, I always think historians should pay more attention to a great definition by the American sociologist David Reisman, who once said that a sincere man is a man who believes his own propaganda. Okay, as well as a dissection of a complex individual, there are also a valuable discussion of the wider question of sectarianism. And here, Professor Farrell dispels some myths. Contrary to what you'll read in more than one account, Drew is not a central figure in the riots of 1857, the worst that Belfast had achieved up to that point. It was the subsequent government-sponsored inquiry that presents him as a symbol of all that is wrong with community relations in Belfast. And it's the write-ups he gets in the liberal and Catholic press that establish him as a bogeyman. His oratory was undoubtedly popular with the Orange Order, but again, there are episodes to show that he was not able to dictate the activities of what remained a overwhelmingly working class organization. And in any case, and this is a really important point that Professor Farrell makes, there's nothing particularly distinctive about Drew's anti-Catholicism. His perception of Rome as a malign and threatening force, and Catholicism as the antithesis of true Christianity, would have been shared by a lot of people. What makes Drew special is, first of all, the strategic location of his church, Christ Church, on the frontier between the Pound and Sandy Row, and secondly, his position as a highly effective pastor working with a Protestant working class that is struggling to come to terms with bewildering economic change and alarming shifts in the political landscape. So, following John Wolfe's distinction, it is context, not content, that transforms anti-Catholicism into sectarianism. Finally, having devoted quite a lot of the last 2 weeks to these two books, I have to ask, do these two figures have anything in common? And the answer, I think, is rather more than you might expect at first sight. Both of them are men deeply engaged with the changing society of their day. Sharman Crawford is an advocate of advanced democracy. Drew is pioneering pastoral services to the new industrial working class. But both men, their biographers suggest, are looking backwards as well as forwards. Drew's insistence on the duty of paternalism on the part of the rich and passive submission to God's will on the part of the poor, Professor Farrell suggests, had its roots in a lingering commitment to the idea of an agrarian hierarchical society as the ideal society. Sharman Crawford is inspired throughout his career by the memory of the volunteers and particularly of his revered father. In addition, Peter Gray suggests his defense of the potential of small-scale farming rests in part on a nostalgic view of the county down landscape of his boyhood, before the mechanization of weaving and spinning had kicked away a vital prop for the smallholding economy. So in both men, grappling with the massive changes in their own society, you also see a surprising element of nostalgia. The second thing they have in common is that both men are outsiders. Now, in the case of Drew, this is obvious. His advocacy of radical electoral reform and a total shift in the relationship between landlord and tenant puts him at odds with the class into which he was born. But Drew, too, is not really an establishment figure. He was praised for his pastoral and his philanthropic work, but his strident and destructive anti-Catholicism and his frequent denunciations of the Protestant establishment itself for not standing up more forcibly against the evil empire of Rome, all of this alienated his superiors and a well of cost in advancement within the church. So once again, we're reminded this is a society in flux, when political and ideological alignments cannot yet be categorized or labeled. One further, and this is the final point, one further common feature is worth mentioning. Here we have two Victorian fathers, both men with strong views passionately held. Yet both men produced daughters who had successful and distinctive independent careers. Mabel Sharman Crawford, born in 1820, published 2 novels, then 2 successful books based on her travels in Italy and in Algeria. Later, she managed a small estate in County Waterford, attempting to put her father's ideas on landlord-tenant cooperation into action. And she became an active campaigner from the 1860s until her death in 1912 for women's suffrage. Catherine Drew, born in 1832, is a pioneer of women's journalism. Her brother had moved to Dublin to work as an architect, and she somehow managed to parlay this into a job for herself as assistant editor of the trade journal, The Irish Builder. She went on to become the London correspondent of the Belfast newsletter, and at the time of her death in 1910, she is president of the Institute of Journalists. And she attributed her success to her father's advanced ideas, which led him to introduce her to branches of study that were then supposed to be suited only to boys. And that, it seems to me, is just one further reminder of the ability of good biographies like these to take us beyond stereotypes, whether of individuals or of whole periods. So I commend both books wholeheartedly to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean, for that really quite wonderful explanation of what the two books are about, and also drawing our attention to the connections between them, sometimes those connections that we didn't quite realize at the time. I'm going to respond really quite quickly just by dealing with kind of two issues. First of all, how I came to be interested in Sharman Crawford as a subject for a biography. And secondly, question which those of you who may have bought the book already are asking yourselves, why is it so damn long? And then just finish with a few thanks to people. So I first encountered William Sharman Crawford a long time ago when I was a PhD student, working on a project looking at the politics of the Great Irish Famine. And back then, in the late 80s, early 90s, the historiography of that subject was still very much dominated by the revisionist collection, as it was labelled, The Great Irish Famine, edited by Robin Dudley Edwards and T.D. Williams in 1956, in whose foreword Kevin Nolan editorialised, quote, that if man, the prisoner of time, acts in conformity with the conventions of society into which he is born, it is difficult to judge him with an irrevocable harshness. So it was with the men of the famine era. And what struck me reading Sharman Crawford's speeches and publications during those catastrophic famine years was his refusal to conform to those social conventions. Although a Protestant Ulster landlord, he articulated not only a focused anger against the willful consignment of thousands to unnecessary deaths through hunger and clearance by both his fellow landlords and the British state, but also an alternative social vision for the reconstruction of Irish rural society on a more equitable basis. So here, I mean, it may have been a batshit crazy scheme, but at least it was proposing a serious alternative, indeed one so serious that elements within the government itself were prepared to consider a similar reclamation scheme to provide mass employment and the redistribution of land. But here, at least, I think, was an oppositional voice making clear that alternative policy choices were indeed available if there had been the political will to seize them. So for these reasons, Crawford piqued my interest, but I decided at the time not to focus explicitly on him, to turn to other projects. However, he popped up again in my next monograph project on the origins and introduction of the 1838 Irish Poor Law, now as a strident advocate in the mid-1830s of a generous and humane welfare system for Ireland based on the compulsory taxation of landed income or the appropriation of the tithes then paid to the established church. And although this view was popular with many in Ireland, it threw him into conflict with a much more socially conservative nationalist tribune, Daniel O'Connell, and his alternative welfare scheme was rejected by the government, which opted instead for a minimalist and regressive workhouse-based poor law, which would fail so spectacularly during the famine a decade later. So again, I put Sharman Crawford aside, but resolved after a period as head of school, which I managed to survive more or less, mentally intact, to pull together. So what I planned to do was to pull together a short biographical study of the man based on his writings and his relatively modest archive in the Public Record Office here in Belfast. But as you can see, it ended up not as a short life, and took rather longer to research and write than I first envisaged. So why is this book? Why is this book so big? It's actually described still on, I think the publisher's website is 750 pages. Now, it's not 750 pages. I think the manuscript originally was that long, but it is nearly 500 pages. And I'm very grateful to my two assiduous and constructive academic reviewers who suggested necessary cuts to the text. It's still quite long. So the problem is, as I mentioned, the absence of much scholarly literature on William Sharman Crawford. And in some ways, it's easy to write an interpretive biography of someone for whom there is already a kind of well-established biographical literature. There is, in his case, no laudatory Victorian biography. And apart from Brian Kennedy's 1953 doctoral dissertation here at Queen's, 20th century historical literature has also been largely silent on him. And I think this reticence has been shaped in part by the dominance of the revolutionary excitements of the 1790s, and on one side, and on the other, the communalist polarizations of the 1880s, which set the patterns of Ulster and Irish politics for the following century. both of which left the intervening periods in relative historiographical shadow, with the exception of the rather outsized political eminence of Daniel O'Connell himself. It's also, I think, in part a consequence of the difficulty of categorizing Sharman Crawford. He was a radical, but neither a nationalist nor a revolutionary. He fell outside the now well-mined biographical terrain of Presbyterian United Irishmen and the cross-denominational Young Irelanders, yet was nevertheless a household name in the politics of Ulster in the 1830s to 50s, and arguably across much of the rest of Ireland, and by the 1840s of Great Britain as well. A second problem, but also, of course, a huge advantage, was the sheer scale of his written output over these 3 decades, not just in the 10 or so political and social pamphlets he published, but in hundreds of lengthy public letters published in the Irish and British press on multiple topics, as well as numerous platform speeches. So Sharman Crawford was, if never a great orator, a man of many words. Which I think I probably ended up myself also being a man of too many words. A third problem emerged with the paucity of historical literature relating to the Irish Tenant League, which Sean has mentioned, in which Crawford played a central, if always controversial, role. Apart from Charles Gavin Duffy's self-serving The League of North and South, published in 1886, the Tenant League remains largely under-researched, despite its critical role in establishing repertoires and arguments that would later be revivified by the much better-known Irish Land League under Michael Davitt and Charles Stewart Parnell after 1879. Writing Crawford's life thus required constructing a framework of Tenant League history to make sense of his place within it, but also to locate what is in many ways the central dramatic episode of the book, the violently contested County Down election of 1852, a pivotal moment when class-based politics competed for primacy with sectarianism and feudalism in the Ulster countryside. The deeper I got into making sense of how this Protestant landed gentleman came to adopt the persona of a popular tribune as a Chartist-endorsed Democratic MP from 1841, as figurehead of the tenant right movement, advocate of a pragmatic federalist solution to the Irish constitutional question, and as a vocal critic of slavery, British imperial expansion, militarism, and church establishments, the more I felt it necessary to undertake an archaeology of his political principles in the equally remarkable career of his father, the radical volunteer Colonel William Sharman, and also to trace the legacies of his ideas through the careers of the 2 most politically engaged of his children, James and Mabel, in Gladstonian and suffragist campaigning, respectively, before the Crawford-Sprint family reverted to a more conventionally landed conservative and Ulster Unionist stance from the 1890s. So the final reason why this book is so long is that what began as a study of an overlooked but significant mid-19th century political figure evolved into a collective family biography, reaching from the mid-18th century and stretching forward to his grandson, Robert Gordon Sharman Crawford's death in 1934. This stretched chronology has allowed for the expansion of the book beyond the biography of William Sharman Crawford himself to the origin and legacies of what might be described as Sharman Crawfordism, was described at the time as Sharman Crawfordism, a set of principles that still had resonance at least up until the First World War, if not beyond. As a consequence, the book offers some wider reflections on the rise and fall, but also the obstinate persistence of an Ulster Protestant radical tradition, taking shape in the political debates and reformist optimism of the volunteer Dungannon conventions in the 1780s and early 90s, before adopting a revolutionary but ultimately catastrophic path into the United Irish Rebellion of 1798. But then reviving in a more constitutionalist manifestation in the reformist, democratic, agrarian, and later women's suffrage manifestations of the 19th century. The political polarization over Home Rule in 1886 divided Ulster radicals and also divided the Sharman Crawford family, and tended to marginalise this non-nationalist liberal strand in Ulster politics, but it never wholly disappeared. And I suggest that there is a strand of continuity between Sharman Crawfordism and the non-aligned radical liberalism of our own times. So I'm getting towards the end, what I have to say. So all books, I've got a few thanks really to people who helped along the way. All books, especially big ones that take a long time to write, can only be brought to completion with the assistance and support of many people. So I'm grateful particularly to Noel Moran of UCD Press and our academic board and publication team for taking a chance with this very long and involved manuscript and patiently steering it through to publication in the beautifully presented and relatively affordable price form that it is taken, as well as, of course, to the press's peer reviewers for the constructive criticisms and suggestions. Research leave granted by Queen's University Belfast was essential to pursue the archival research to write the book, and I'm thankful for the support of the staff of my academic colleagues, for the support from the staff of my academic home in the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics, and especially to its then head, Alistair Muskimmon, and to our Irish Studies Administrator, Cathy Devlin, for their support. My colleagues, Andrew Holmes and Sean Connolly, who are here, read part of the text in draft and provided very useful feedback. And it's been shaped by conversations with other colleagues at Queen's and elsewhere, too numerous to name individually. However, I should single out, not least because he's here, my friend Sean Farrell of Northern Illinois University, always a stimulating thinker on Ulster politics in the 19th century, and with whom it's a great privilege to share today's book launch. Gladstone's Library in Hawarden in Wales provided a vital and inspiring writing retreat location in autumn 2019, and I'm grateful to its then warden, Peter Francis, for his hospitality, and perhaps something of the spirit of the grand old man infuses the finished product, if only in terms of longevity. In the same year, Frank Boyd also kindly responded to my inquiries and gave me a tour of Redeeman House, another Sharman Crawford property in Domain, and the nearby Sharman Crawford Mausoleum at Kilmore, near Crossgar. Photographs of the largely unknown Sharman Crawford monument on the Redeeman estate that appear in the book were taken on that occasion. Archivists and librarians at many institutions, especially Prony, have been extremely helpful, despite the challenges posed for them, as for all of us, by the COVID pandemic in 2020 to 21. Finally, I'd like to thank my family for their support over the years, most especially my partner, Emily Mark Fitzgerald, who can't be here today. Without his unfailing support and wisdom, the book may never have come to completion. So thank you all for coming. I was going to invite you now for a glass of wine, but I'm not. I'm going to invite Sean Farrell to speak briefly, and then I will invite you all to share a glass of wine and some snacks with us. So, Sean.
I'm quite cognizant that I am what's between you and the wine right now, having been set up for that role. Thanks for coming this afternoon. I know it's a busy time of year, but it's just absolutely wonderful to see so many familiar and friendly faces here today. I first came to Belfast in 1993, which basic math tells me I've been coming here regularly for 30 years now. Something that underlines not only my fascination with Belfast's 19th century history, but it's the power of routine and that, frankly, certainly a lack of imagination, if nothing else. As I came off, so I walked actually from my flat Saturday night to get groceries to the lashing rain and wind of Saturday night. I couldn't help but think I'd made some wrong choices in my life. I very vividly remember my 1993 initiation to Belfast. Huddled in my Kitchener Street flat, something that my mom's Methodist church had set up through a connection they had in Belfast. Unable to figure out how to light a coal fire. The bourgeois kid from Seattle, Washington, I certainly couldn't manage that. But this was a cold sojourn that was quickly broken by a warm lunch with Liam Kennedy at Bookfinders Cafe and the warm fellowship with Ronnie Buchanan and Brian Walker's Institute of Irish Studies, then on Fitzwilliam Street. Like Peter, I plan to talk briefly about how I came to this project and what I see as its broader significance before saying a word of thanks, although I'm going to take the briefly thing a little more seriously. Thomas Drew was the Church of Ireland rector of Christ Church from 1832 to 1859, an active conservative evangelical and a leading figure in the Orange Order, a political pastor widely known for his anti-Catholic lectures and sermons. In short, I did not come to this book or its subject because of political or religious affinities. but rather I saw Drew as an important figure in a phenomenon. I was very interested in the linkages between conservatism, religion, and working class politics in Belfast. I was certainly aware of Drew, the notorious rabble-rouser, and had written about him in a generalized way as a minor figure in my first book about 10,000 years ago. The first time I saw something more in Drew, however, was when I read his sermons on various subjects, an 1838 two-volume primer of sermons designed for his working-class congregants. I remember reading this at the Lindenhall Library and was struck by their conventional nature. There was little to no anti-Catholic invective here, but rather a heavily signposted and at times condescending focus on social and spiritual reformation. Certainly more Hannah More than Hugh Hannah. At the time, as I said, I was writing a book or planning to write a book on conservative politics, religion, and working class culture. But this is the first time I remember seeing Drew as a potential vehicle for some of the questions that interested me about early to mid-Victorian Belfast. This is not a traditional biography in the same way that Peter's book is. I think it's safe to say. It's a lot shorter, if nothing else. I'm going to rip on that. I apologize. I'll buy you a beer later. Drew is, as Professor Connolly underlined, a fascinating character, and at least two of his children are worthy of study in their own light. Sir Thomas Drew, the famous architect, and Catherine Drew, a pioneering journalist who moved to London after her father's death. But as interesting as these personal details of Drew's life were, I was more interested in his relationships with various constituencies in Victorian Belfast. His largely working class congregants. The problem of being old but trying to talk about a phone is then you lose your place on the super phone, and then you have to do something like this until you find it. Okay. So his working class congregants, the conservative establishment, and his ardent and largely plebeian supporters in the Orange Lodges, places like Sandy Row and Blind Carrot. These groups had varying interests, of course. The hyperbolic anti-Catholicism that played well on the Orange Lodge circuit was generally viewed with distaste within a Belfast political establishment more interested in social stability and civic progress. It was Drew's hybridity, his ability to straddle these various worlds at times, was essential to his success in Belfast, and the book makes that case. His advocacy for church construction, religious education, and a kind of paternalism for the Protestant working class were key elements in his appeal. Something that I think allows Drew to better fit within the more complex portraits of 19th century Belfast politics that have emerged in the last 20 years. I would say it also allows us to see interesting moments that defy more simplistic portraits of Belfast political life. In 1847, when the Catholic Vindicator supports Drew over his advocacy for all island distribution of famine relief. And in 1868, when Drew and William Johnston support Isaac Butt's ideas about land reform, a position shaped both by Drew's fears of Protestant rural depopulation, he was then in Northern Ireland, and his distrust, of course, of the Belfast political establishment. This certainly doesn't make him any less of a conservative. Drew nearly always returned to support the businessmen and landlords who dominated the Conservative Party. But however ephemeral, Drew's populist independence was part of his appeal and helps to account for his success. As in all histories, I think, there are very few monochrome stories. Finally, I'd like to open my thanks period here by thanking Peter Gray for showing a characteristic generosity and sharing this launch with me, and thus ensuring that somebody would show up. It's good to be here to direct it. Peter and I have talked about mid-19th century Ulster history and Irish studies over various shades of IPA over the years, and it seems appropriate to launch our books here together in Belfast. I'd also like to thank Professor Sean Connolly for launching the books this afternoon in such a detailed and thoughtful fashion. Professor Connolly, both through his own work and supervision of young historians like Alice Johnson and Jonathan Wright, has improved our understanding of 19th century Belfast more than any single figure in Irish historical studies. And I'm honored to have you here. There are a number of people who have made my trips to Belfast more productive and enjoyable over the years. From the beginning, Liam Kennedy has been a warm and supportive friend to this former student of Jim Donnelly, someone who has hosted me at countless dinners at Rugby Road, a pleasant and humane contrast to the dinners I cobbled together from Spar and Russell's Green. Olwen Purdue has always taken time for me for her excessively busy schedule to meet for a tea or a glass of wine. And though she may not remember, I first met Olwen at her own book launch at Queen's University Bookshop. It's amazing because she wrote it when she was 5 years old. And I'm sorry that I won't be able to join her when we celebrate her book in the new year. While we are both unsure the time we first met, I'd like to thank Don Bryan for his friendship and support and congenial company over the years. His own recent book on urban space and modern Belfast, done with Sean Connolly and others, is a reminder that there are brains as well as beauty. And no, I don't think anthropology should replace history in which people connect with the world. He's not here, but I'd like also to thank Brian Walker, who was assistant director of the Institute when I first came to Belfast 30 years ago, and has met for coffee or lunch on many occasions since then, taking me on a wonderful visit a few years ago to St. George's Church in QUB. I'd also like to thank Marie Coleman, who, despite her support for the Boston Red Sox, has been an important supporter and professional colleague over the years. And I would finally be remiss if I didn't mention Ida Milne, who is here from Carluke today and gave a wonderful talk earlier this afternoon. Something that echoes her memorable March 2020 drive up to Belfast to pick me up in the midst of COVID and deliver me to Dublin Airport, something she did to keep me off the bus or train at that time. She then left me to Dublin Airport where there were thousands of others. But I still thank Ida for it. Finally, my mention of Queen's University Bookshop reminds me to thank No Alibis Bookstore, which so ably keeps the tradition alive and providing a space for the intellectual and cultural life here in Belfast. And thanks again to everyone for coming today. It means the world to me to get a chance to launch this book in a place where I began my career 30 years ago. Cheers, thank you.
Oh yeah. If anybody wants to ask any questions, we are prepared to answer questions, but don't feel that you need to ask questions. But if anyone's desperate, yes.
Yeah, that's one of the two books. How would you say that each of them is proactive and reactive to the society that they're living in at the time?
The individuals that we describe, gosh.
I'll let you have that one.
Well, I think kind of inevitably, we're both writing about figures operating in the public sphere very much, but different public spheres. In my case, a political public sphere. In Sean's case, a religious sphere, which also is political. Yeah, in my case, I suppose a political sphere, which is also religious. So they're obviously responding to the crises, the political events which surround them, to the rise of mass movements, which they're contributing to and responding to as well, and seeking to shape and to provide leadership for as well. So I think that's probably all I want to say on that, except there's much more detail in the book if you want to buy it and to read it.
Yeah, no, I would say a similar thing about Drew, who is not particularly inventive in any of the particular things that he does in response to this environment, but it's the combination of the various elements he's putting together in one contentious and confrontationalist package that's in a space, that is in a divisive potential space, which makes it of interest. But he's not, I wouldn't think of Drew as particularly proactive.
More reactive.
Yeah, more reactive. But it's the combination of the various things that he brings together in the way that he packages them, if you will, and where he packages them that makes him an interesting figure and one of note.
Yeah, the back.
This is actually just the book topic. What, if if you could sort of sum up in a nutshell, what drew you to both characters, write about them specifically?
So I think I've already answered that already in the case of Sharman Crawford, because I mean I think it was that oppositional voice, that kind of that political irritant role, a crotchety role, as Sean described, the kind of, I suppose, pushing back against the kind of the dominant ideologies and the kind of dominant forms of social power of his time. That made him particularly interesting to me at a time, of tremendous change and catastrophic events within Irish society.
I would say it's a couple of things, but one of which I kind of mentioned a little bit more. I have always been interested in kind of the linkages between kind of the development of a kind of working class conservatism in an industrial town here and its relations with politics and religion. I guess what drew me to Drew, to answer your question, and to use the word twice within 8 words there, which I critique my students on, would be that the portrait of Drew, as I found him, was so monochrome that it interested me to try and, why did people find him appealing? Surely, if he was just this portrait, he would not have been a successful minister at Christ Church in these different capacities for 25, 26 years.
Exactly what I was saying.
So just to try and define these various elements, and to me, and this, remember the wine is there, because this potentially leads to a wider discussion. To me, the only way you can understand the appeal of somebody like Drew is if you provide the nuance and complexity of the full portrait, which included this kind of vitriolic anti-Catholicism, certainly. But if it was just a one-note thing, surely he would have retained his popularity, his connection through times that are dramatically changing. So I think the only thing that it drew me to him is this monochrome portrait, and then finding the depth of other factors that were critical in establishing relationships with the various constituencies in town that he had to be successful, or in some ways. I hope that answers my question. Yes.
A quick one.
Yeah.
Christchurch, although it may have been on the edge of a developing working class area, was still extraordinarily close to those grand terrace houses and the Belfast bourgeoisie, all of whom were possibly not Presbyterian.
No.
So within his congregation, did he not have commercially, professionally influential people who would have appreciated his evangelicalism, which was part of the rising evangelicalism in the Church of Ireland anyway?
Well, the answer is yes, he did. And if you look at the total numbers of congregants, it's a largely working class congregation, but particularly in the early years, the first decade and a half, he had really key figures like Richard Davison, Charles Lanyon, and all are members of the Christchurch congregation. And that circle of successful supporters, and Davison calls himself a patron of Druze and whatnot, were absolutely critical. So that mixture of kind of very successful middle, upper class people who find a substantive and important minority within that congregation are there from early age, and only move out, I think, when you get the more suburbanization of housing later in late in his tenure.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Thank you. Mostly because I knew the answer.
So I think we might wind up formal proceedings there for this evening. So thank you all very much for coming. I should have mentioned earlier, David Torrance, who's our good friend from No Alibis, is there at the back with some books for sale at a discounted price on the table. So if you'd like either of the books, have a chat with David. He may want some money in return, but they are there. And then through the doors there, we have wine and refreshments. So please stay and share a drink and a mince pie, I believe, with us before you go, and you have an opportunity to speak to any of the three of us informally as well. So thank you all for coming, and good evening.